Good evening, everyone. My name is Jordan Kaiser. I'm a junior here at Clemson University, majoring in political science, and I'm also a Lyceum Scholar. Thank you very much for joining us for the Lyceum Student Speakers Series evening on Plato's Euthyphro. The Euthyphro is of special importance to us at the program because of its topic, piety, and also because every student who takes Introduction to Political Theory begins their very first semester here with it. In fact, both of tonight's presentations stem from the very first papers that our speakers wrote as freshman Lyceum Scholars. Our first speaker tonight is Miss Emily Bowling. She's a sophomore here at Clemson, majoring in political science, and she's also a Lyceum Scholar. Emily is from Clover, South Carolina, and she's the president of Clemson's Young Americans for Liberty chapter. In her free time, she enjoys the lost arts of photography and cross-stitching. Our second speaker tonight is Mr. Sergio Gonzales-Varela. He's a freshman here at Clemson, also majoring in political science, and also a Lyceum Scholar. He was born in Saltillo, Mexico, but has lived in Seneca, South Carolina for most of his life. He also played on the Seneca High School tennis team for 4 years, and his favorite book is Catch-22. Each of our respective speakers will present for about 12 minutes, after which time we'll open the floor for a Q&A session. When we start the Q&A, we do ask that you stand up and introduce yourself before addressing the speakers. I'll hand the floor over to them now. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Jordan. In the Euthyphro, Socrates explores the definition of the pious with Euthyphro, a man who claims to have unshared knowledge of the divine and of the pious. Through consistent questioning and unwavering dedication to reason, Socrates unveils Euthyphro's lack of comprehension regarding the pious and highlights the importance of fully understanding a claim before making it. In sections 10a through 11b, Socrates and Euthyphro consider the question, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved? And through in-depth examination of the question, conclude that the pious is loved by the gods because it is pious. In order to reach this conclusion, Socrates repeatedly asks questions that lead Euthyphro down a complex path of fully developed reasoning and understanding, and force Euthyphro to admit his initial lack of understanding of the concept of piety. Throughout the text, Euthyphro is presented as a caricature of ignorance. He claims to be more knowledgeable of the pious than any other Athenian, while clearly knowing very little about the subject. His ignorance is particularly highlighted when contrasted with the unmatched wisdom of Socrates, which was later revealed to be rooted in the admission that he himself knows nothing. Euthyphro unashamedly makes easily refutable and underdeveloped claims, including his claim that the pious is whatever all the gods love, and that the opposite, whatever all the gods hate, is impious. Additionally, Euthyphro consistently attempts to avoid Socrates' questions about his claims that he is unable to answer, yet rarely admits his own lack of understanding. However, when asked the question, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it's loved, Euthyphro shamefully admits that he does not understand the question. This unashamed admission of confusion further reveals Euthyphro's true ignorance towards the concept of piety and tears down his previous facade of wisdom. Although it was previously made apparent by his evasion of difficult questions that Euthyphro did not have a complete understanding of the essence of piety, his inability to understand a question regarding the relationship between two subjects he claims to have exclusive knowledge of, the dear to the gods and the pious, highlights the shallowness of his understanding, especially in comparison to the depth of Socrates' questions. If Euthyphro were truly an expert, as he claims, such a question would pose no threat to him, especially considering that he claims to understand the relationship between the pious and the dear to the gods already. However, Euthyphro shamelessly admits that he doesn't understand the question and unintentionally reveals his true ignorance in the process. Seeing Euthyphro's ignorance, Socrates leads Euthyphro through the dissection of the question at hand piece by piece, beginning by illustrating what exactly defines something loved, such as the pious, as something loved. In order to define such an abstract concept, Socrates first discusses the difference between the carried and the carrying, the led and the leading, and the seen and the seeing, in order to highlight the difference between the loved and the loving. Once Socrates confirms Euthyphro's understanding of how all such things are different from each other, in that one thing is being acted upon while the other acts upon it, he asks Euthyphro, is the thing carried something carried because it is carried, or because of something else? Euthyphro then concedes that the carried is in fact something carried because it is carried, which leads Socrates to continue using the words led, carried, and seen to further illustrate what makes something loved. He tells of how something is led because it is led, and something is seen because it is seen. In classic Socratic fashion, the dialogue continues with a series of questions that ultimately lead Euthyphro to concede to the arguments of Socrates. Euthyphro eventually agrees with Socrates' logic that, quote, if something comes to be something or is affected, it isn't because it is something coming to be that it comes to be, but because it comes to be, it is something coming to be, end quote. Rather, if something is coming to be, it isn't the process of becoming that defines it as such, but rather the fact that it will come to be. Upon this agreement, Socrates concludes his explanations of what defines something loved, such as the pious, as something loved, by explaining that it is just like the previous ones in that because it is loved, it is something loved. Following this question, the dialogue continues to dissect the question, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved? Socrates and Euthyphro depart from the intricacies of what characterizes something loved as something loved, and begin to explore the differences between the pious and the loved by the gods. Euthyphro's previous claim that the pious is the same as what is loved by the gods is dismantled immediately by his admission that the pious is loved by the gods because it is pious, and that the dear to the gods is dear to the gods because it's loved by the gods. Socrates draws attention to this discrepancy, pointing out that the dear to the gods is not pious, rather that the one is different from the other. He further explains that the dear to the gods and the pious cannot be the same, because, on one hand, if the pious were loved because of being pious, the dear to the gods would also be loved because of being dear to the gods. On the other hand, if the dear to the gods were dear to the gods because of being loved by the gods, the pious would also be pious because of being loved. Put more simply, Socrates explains that the dear to the gods is the sort of thing to be loved because it is loved, while the pious is loved because it is the sort of thing to be loved. By disproving Euthyphro's claim that the pious is the same as the dear to the gods, Socrates elaborates on the difference between that which is loved by the gods and that which is pious, as well as answers the question, is the pious loved by the gods because it's pious, or is it pious because it's loved? The implications of Socrates' question provide substantial evidence for Meletus' charges against Socrates of impiety and corruption of the youth. For if the pious is loved by the gods simply for being pious, as Socrates claims, then an intrinsic quality or path of reasoning exists that allows the gods to identify the pious and guide their subjects accordingly. If such a quality or path exists, then nothing prevents humans, especially Socrates, from discovering this quality or path of reasoning through philosophy, which would render the wisdom and guidance of the gods useless by enabling humans to discover the pious on their own. Furthermore, even if Socrates claimed that the pious is pious because it's loved by the gods, the question of the validity of the wisdom of the gods remains. If the gods make decisions about what's pious based on arbitrary whims instead of a set path of reasoning, then humans have blindly based their morality on the aimless wishes of divine beings who may not even have their best interest at heart. Without an unwavering quality or path of reasoning to define the pious, nothing prevents the gods from loving and encouraging that which is harmful to mankind. The value of the gods' wisdom is challenged by either answer to Socrates' question, and is therefore challenged by the question itself. And by publicly making such bold inquiries in Athens, where the wisdom of the gods is the foundation of the law, Socrates openly calls into question not only the authority of the most highly regarded beings, but also the validity of the city's laws. Socrates thus provides evidence for Meletus' claims that Socrates is corrupting the youth, as Socrates encourages others, especially the city's youth, to question in the same way he does, by questioning very publicly and very directly. Moreover, he provides evidence for Meletus' accusations of impiety, considering that publicly questioning the city's laws and the gods upon which they rest was clearly not considered pious in ancient Athens. Socrates goes so far as to have this discussion of piety with Euthyphro on the porch of the king, a public building that housed the office of the Athenian official with the highest jurisdiction on legal matters regarding the gods. Socrates not only questions the value of the gods' wisdom, but moreover questions the validity of the city's laws in a place associated with an official who should have the most knowledge on such subjects. Socrates thus disrespects the authority of the city and likely turns the city's officials, who control the fate of his trial and therefore his life, against him. Despite this, Socrates continues to ask risky and difficult questions in his never-ending pursuit for truth, and refuses to value the opinions of the many or of the city more than he values his quest for truth. It's this never-ending pursuit that Socrates encourages Euthyphro to embark on, as the conclusion that the pious is loved by the gods because it is pious opens up countless new questions regarding the subject of piety, and dismantles Euthyphro's previous beliefs on the subject entirely. For if Euthyphro agrees that the pious is loved by the gods because it is pious, he cannot logically agree that the dear to the gods and the pious are the same. Socrates encourages Euthyphro and the city of Athens to view such misunderstandings as opportunities for learning, not punishment, and to explore truth no matter the risk such exploration poses. Have at it, Sergio.
Piety, as argued at lines 14b, 3-4 in Plato's Euthyphro, is the knowledge of sacrificing and praying, a conclusion that is developed through Socrates' interrogation of Euthyphro. Socrates' argument seems to be that perhaps piety is not only the practice of prayer and sacrifice, but also having a total awareness of the benefits that come from performing these actions. The worth of piety to those who are pious is revealed near the end of Plato's Euthyphro, when Socrates suggests an economic definition of the term. Leading up to this, Euthyphro claims that if someone has knowledge of how to say and do things gratifying to the gods by praying and sacrificing, then these are the pious things, and that these pious things preserve families as well as the communities of cities. On the other hand, Euthyphro argues that impious things are the opposite in that they overturn and destroy everything in the community. Socrates, going along with Euthyphro, posits that perhaps piety is a certain kind of knowledge of sacrificing and praying. Euthyphro agrees, so Socrates continues his line of reasoning by defining sacrificing as giving gifts to the gods and praying as making requests to the gods. Although these resemble the actions of religious persons, Socrates makes these connections so that piety sounds no different from an economic transaction between two parties. Euthyphro concedes these definitions to Socrates, going so far as to say, "You have comprehended what I said, Socrates, quite nobly." To which Socrates replies, "Yes, for I am desirous, my dear man, of your wisdom, and I am applying my mind to it, so that whatever you say won't fall to the ground in vain." Socrates then asks Euthyphro whether one could refer to the sacrificing and praying as a service to the gods, and if so, if this service requests from and gives to them being the gods, to which Euthyphro says, "I do." So just what service might man possibly provide to the gods? Socrates and Euthyphro have not made that clear. However, referring to these acts as a service serves to cement the more economic definition of piety. Next, Euthyphro agrees that the only things that should be requested from the gods are those things that are needed. Socrates also points out to Euthyphro that the gods do not require or desire gifts that they do not need, because it would be a waste on both sides. For it wouldn't be artful for a giver to bring someone gifts that are not needed. And Euthyphro agrees. In this context, the artful is not associated with the abstract and beautiful. Instead, artful is simply associated with the knowledge of what is useful and needed by the gods. The trade between man and the gods is useful because both humans and the gods can gain something that they need that they nonetheless could not acquire without the other. At this point, Socrates reaches the conclusion that piety is a certain art of commerce, in which both the gods and men partake. When humans sacrifice to the gods, they expect that the gods will be pleased by what has been offered. In return, the gods will listen to their prayers. This expectation of the gods' approval is the knowledge of sacrificing and praying that Socrates referenced earlier in the text. The people who pray and sacrifice properly should be knowledgeable of what is useful to and needed by the gods. This is a major departure from the conventional understanding of piety. Instead of piety being religious devotion, piety is that whereby men can get what they need through the knowledge of what the gods themselves need. This is piety reduced to the art of commerce. When confronted with his new understanding of piety, Euthyphro agrees with Socrates by saying that defining piety as a commerce is acceptable if it's more pleasing to Socrates to give it this name. Socrates next delves into what benefits the gods get from the sacrifices of prayers men offer. One of the fundamental reasons as to why trade takes place is because both sides in an exchange see the benefit from trading goods and services. It would not make sense for the gods to trade with mortals if there was nothing beneficial in it for them. Therefore, the gods must benefit from the gifts they get from humans. Euthyphro then asks Socrates if he supposes that the gods do in fact benefit from the things that humans offer. For if the gods benefit from humans, then humans appear to have some control over the gods. This then opens up the possibility for the gods to be bribable, because men have something of value to the gods that only they have. So, the gods are no longer godlike in this economic understanding of piety, because men can sway them through prayer and sacrifice into doing something that they would not have done originally. Euthyphro does not believe this to be true. Earlier in the dialogue, he compares the relationship between humans and the gods to that between a slave and a master. Upon first examination, Euthyphro's analogy is consistent with his line of reasoning that gods have unlimited power over men. Therefore, they do not benefit from what men have to offer. And while slave owners certainly treat their slaves like lesser beings and have unlimited power over them, the slave owners do stand to benefit from the work of their slaves because the owner receives the fruit of labor without having to pay the slave consistently, if at all. And if the master cannot provide the slave with housing and food, then the slave cannot do the job, and then the owner would not receive any benefit. Furthermore, Euthyphro agrees with Socrates on the point that the gods and humans need one another for this commerce to take place. The difference between needing and benefiting is trivial when observed carefully, To need a good or service is to require something that is missing. Similarly, to benefit from a good or service is to gain something that was either not there before or to gain more of said thing. Therefore, both terms involve personal gain. Using the analogy of the slave owner, a master needs his slave just as he also stands to benefit from them. Therefore, Euthyphro contradicts himself when he says that there is a difference between needing and benefiting from something. Both these terms describe the gods' requirements of humans in commercial exchange. Nevertheless, Euthyphro continues. He proposes that what the gods get from man is honor and respect and gratitude, all terms that would be associated with conventional ideas of piety. Socrates asks Euthyphro if piety is based off gratification and not dearness, because he knows that if he asks this, Euthyphro will not be able to help himself in circling back to his original argument of piety being what is dear to the gods. After Euthyphro takes the bait and goes back to describing piety as what is dear to the gods, Socrates pounces on Euthyphro's argument, accusing him of circulatory reasoning. Socrates voices his discontent with Euthyphro's answer by accusing him once more of being like Daedalus, a Greek inventor famous for creating machines that walked about on their own. In this case, Euthyphro creates arguments that do not stand firmly, but instead move around in circles. The reason that Socrates gives Euthyphro a tough time while interrogating him is because of Euthyphro's certainty. If Euthyphro did not present himself as knowing piety and impiety, Socrates would not press him as hard as he does. It is this certainty in his own knowledge that makes Socrates want to expose Euthyphro for having a faulty understanding of piety. To clarify, it is established previously in the dialogue that piety is not simply what is dear to the gods, an argument that Euthyphro does not grasp completely because he circles back to it at the end of the Euthyphro. Euthyphro's understanding suffers from the inability of the gods to agree on what is right and wrong, pious and impious, and just and unjust. There can be no discernible pattern that would accurately portray piety, since no consensus can be reached between the gods. The gods, just like mortals, argue about these critical questions, so no agreement can be reached. Because something is loved or dear to the gods does not mean that said thing is pious. All it means is that it is dear to the gods, which, to repeat, is Euthyphro's conclusion at 15a, 10 through 11. These conclusions are important because they establish the complicated nature of piety, and they also highlight the dangers of Euthyphro's own personal version of piety. Euthyphro thinks that imitation of the gods is the truest form of piety. Piety is imitation. Piety is doing what is dear to the gods. Piety is going against one's unjust father. This is a stark contrast from the city's more conservative version of piety, a piety that seeks to preserve families and the city itself. Euthyphro is not willing to accept that his definition of piety is dangerous to the city and to the family structure of Athens, for as far as he is concerned, his own failure to imitate Zeus on this occasion will not only be unjust, but impious as well. Euthyphro's understanding of piety is dangerous to the city because to go against one's own father in imitation of the gods is to have no respect for the customs and traditions of the city. Euthyphro himself argues that preserving families is a pious act, so going against one's own father is an impious act because it goes against the preservation of the family and the community. To allow men as equally brash and zealous as Euthyphro to go against the customs of the city is to allow piety, which should serve the well-being of the community, to be that which leads to the destruction of the community. In pointing out the flaws in Euthyphro's logic, Socrates aims to moderate Euthyphro. The Euthyphro itself shows Socrates offering this good, this service, not only to Euthyphro himself, but to Athens herself. But instead of appreciating Socrates' service, Euthyphro responds by saying, "Some other time then, Socrates, for I am in a hurry to go somewhere and it is time for me to go away," ultimately leaving Socrates to face his accusers alone.
It's going to be all the time we have. Can I have a round of applause for our two speakers? Thank you all for coming.